I'm Deb Kimmett, and this is the news brief for January 17th, 2022. This is the first news brief of the year, so Happy New Year. And today is also Martin Luther King Day. A shout out goes to the Massage Health Practitioners and COVID-19 Facebook group for calling some of this to my attention. I also belong to various lists that provide overviews of the research that's out there as well. And you'll notice at the bottom of the slides, I have an abbreviated source. I mainly want you to see the author and the date because I try to bring the most current research. The full citation is in the companion PDF file. And remember, science changes, so what we know today may not be what we know tomorrow. This means that the information presented here is going to evolve and will evolve and change as we learn more. There are several big news items over the last month, so let's get to it. The CDC reduced the quarantine time for asymptomatic people. So if you're asymptomatic and have an infection, you want to quarantine for 5 days instead of 10. If you're exposed but not boosted, 5 days quarantine plus 5 days masking. If you're exposed and boosted, no quarantine, but masking for 10 days. And the reason why they're doing this is they're saying that the highest transmission is early, 2 days before symptom onset and 2 to 3 days afterwards. And they're also recommending testing 5 days after exposure. And note that it says recommended. We'll talk about that in a moment. Also, the CDC said that, quote, if symptoms occur, individuals should immediately quarantine until a negative test confirms symptoms are not attributable to COVID-19, unquote. As you may have heard, the move was, quote, hailed by business groups and slammed by some union leaders and health experts, unquote. The critics of this new policy say that the decision was not based on public health and will end up leading to more transmission and force sick workers back to work. The critics are also concerned that there's no negative test requirement. It's considered, quote, a best practice, unquote, which is a suggestion, but not a requirement or even a strong recommendation. In short, leading epidemiologists, nurses unions, and the American Medical Association all pushed back, saying that it was a bad idea. Let's emphasize one thing again. These guidelines have the potential to increase the risk of transmission. Well, how does it do that? Well, the AMA says that even the CDC acknowledges that 31%, again, that's 31% of people are still infectious after 5 days. And without a test, you won't know if the person is still infectious. Also, nurses wear PPE at work, but they may not out in public, which means that they could expose people. And finally, even though the guidelines say to wear a mask for another 5 days after the quarantine, it's likely that the unvaccinated won't. And that statement comes from Megan Ranney, who is Brown University's Associate Dean of Public Health. Now, the CDC says that the change is based on science. But there are a lot of moving parts here that question that. First of all, again, Brown's University Dean of Public Health says that, quote, for the unvaccinated, the data doesn't really back up that they become non-infectious after 5 days, unquote. And the American Nurses Association says the same thing, that at this time, the data doesn't support the change. On top of that, one journalist blogged that the change came 1 week after Delta Airlines wrote in asking for the change. What's interesting, though, is that the CDC's own website talks at length about staffing shortages, impact on education, and so on. And then in the next breath says that, quote, studies show that 25 to 30% of the people isolate for the full 10 days, unquote. Well, if you think about it, that could be read as, well, people don't do it anyway, so why bother? That and there's a shortage of tests. And the healthcare workers may not have access to testing. So remember when the CDC said at the beginning of the pandemic, don't wear masks because there weren't enough masks to go around? Well, this sounds like this might be part of that equation. So really what's going on here is that it appears that the CDC is trying to balance maintaining the economy with the lack of testing and with public health, and they're not really doing a very good job of it. The experts like Michael Mina and all these nursing and medical associations are saying that testing needs to be required to come out of a short quarantine, not just couched as a best practice or a recommendation. And also, we're talking about antigen tests here. So what's the massage therapist takeaway here? After quarantine, take an antigen test before starting back to work. It's the responsible thing to do, and that's what we strongly recommend. Speaking of antigen testing, there are 4 more things to report here. First of all, insurance companies as of January 15th are now required to cover at-home COVID tests, up to 8 free tests per person per month. That breaks down to testing roughly twice a week, which is what's recommended for antigen testing. Also, starting January 19th, each household will be eligible to receive 4 free tests, including free shipping from the government. Order them at covidtests.gov. A free hotline is also being set up. That info is not really available as yet, but tests will be shipped 7 to 12 days after being ordered, and eventually 1 billion tests will be available. The massage therapist takeaway from these 2 items? I encourage you to test regularly, at least twice a week, particularly during any surges, when the positivity rate is above 5%, or when the infection rate is above 1. And remember those last 2 metrics from the earlier in the pandemic? If the positivity rate is 5% or more, that was the metric for shutting things down and opening them back up. And when the infection rate is above 1, it means that the virus is spreading. So those are the 2 metrics that I'm suggesting we go by. Remember, as we've covered this in a previous news brief, these antigen tests are pretty reliable in telling you if you are infectious or contagious. But what about Omicron? Does it pick up the Omicron variant? That brings me to the 3rd item on testing, is whether the antigen test can pick up Omicron. And the conclusion is, yes, they do. Caitlin Jetelina, who does the Your Local Infectious Disease Epidemiologist blog, states that the confusion about whether the rapid test detects Omicron goes back to that FDA and CDC holding the rapid test to the PCR standards. We've talked about this in a previous video. And remember, just to refresh your memory, those PCR tests tell us whether a person is infected, and the antigen tests tell us whether a person is infectious. Those are 2 very different things. Jetelina confirms that yes, the antigen test can detect Omicron, and this is based on info from the companies themselves and researchers in the UK that tested this out in the lab. Real-world studies need to bear this out. Something she said, though, brought another testing controversy to my attention, and that's swabbing the throat along with the nose when you use those antigen tests. Let's take a look at this a little deeper. Jetelina brings up the topic because it appears that the Omicron virus shows up in the saliva before it shows up in the nose, and that a non-peer-reviewed study shows that saliva swabs may work better. The controversy comes in because the FDA says that these tests weren't designed that way, but that's their job to say that until things have been studied. The FDA also says that throat swabs, quote, if used incorrectly, can cause harm to the patient, unquote. While it's not mentioned in the article referenced, it appears that there's concern that the swab will break or snap off. Some tests that I've seen are designed to do just that, because you put it in a test tube, snap off the handle, and seal it up. So there is some caution when swabbing the throat too. But what I look at ultimately is what other countries are doing. And the US uses a lot of guidance coming out of Israel. And a few days after all these articles came out, the Ministry of Health in Israel said that, yeah, swab the throat and nose. And they said they're recommending this even though the manufacturer says not to. Israel's instructions are to swab the throat and 1 nostril. And the same article in here says that the experts are recommending throat swabs because people are infectious before the virus shows up in the nose. And anecdotally, that's what we're seeing in the Massage Health Practitioners and COVID-19 Facebook group too. They have swabbed the nose and gotten a negative test, but then when they added the throat swab into it, then their test is positive. So anecdotally, that's what's happening. The massage therapist takeaway of this? Well, because Israel has come out and said, yes, do it, I strongly suggest swabbing the throat too when taking an antigen test. Just be gentle when doing it. And follow these guidelines that Jetelina suggests, which is to avoid swabbing after eating or drinking anything acidic, because that might cause a false positive. And avoid brushing your teeth or using mouthwash before swabbing. which can cause a false negative. And also watch this video before attempting to do it. And with any of these links that I mentioned here, you'll find the links in the accompanying PDF. And finally, I want to call your attention to a couple of good reads. First, there's an article where the subtitle on the article says it all. Seeing the latest variant as milder is just as right as seeing it as potentially more dangerous. The article itself covers the difficulty, contradictions, and uncertainty of making policy. For example, here are a few of the contradictions that are out there. Hospitalizations will be less likely with Omicron, but it's also true that the hospitals will be swamped. Or saying that boosters are needed, but there's lots of breakthrough cases. Or here's another one, that the more people feel safe and let their guard down, the less safe it is for those who are at higher risk. These and other contradictions color how you see the pandemic. So for example, the first one is, it's inevitable. Everybody's going to get it. It's impossible to contain it. And we're not going to get the high vaccination rate. So why bother? The second viewpoint is the zero tolerance, which is zero COVID. You can contain it and we have to. And then the third view is from those who sort of live in between those two. They take calculated risks. Okay, so that's one article that I think is a really good one to take a look at. The other one is layered on top of that first article is a post from the Massage Health Practitioners and COVID-19 Facebook group. The main message of this post is don't fall into the number one, which is that fatalistic view that we're all going to get it, so don't do anything, and that we just need to let ourselves get the virus and just get it over with. That's the message of that post and why we shouldn't. And the reason why we don't want to take that viewpoint is because of what this Facebook post says. It talks about how researchers have just recently published this huge study and come to the conclusion that the leading cause of multiple sclerosis is Epstein-Barr virus, meaning that those who've had mononucleosis when they were younger have a much higher risk of developing multiple sclerosis later in life. And just like HIV causes AIDS or chickenpox causes shingles, researchers are really starting to study these kinds of connections in depth. We still really don't know a lot about the long-term effects of COVID, but according to the post on the COVID Facebook group, we know that T cells die with COVID, and that in itself is a sign of AIDS and immune deficiency. And as they say in the Facebook post, quote, not to mention vascular damage to the heart and brain, unquote. And, you know, I'd also add lung damage to that as well. The massage therapist takeaway from both of these good reads, please don't let your guard down because Omicron is considered mild, and don't fall prey to the idea that everyone's going to get COVID, because we don't really know the long-term effects of COVID yet, or what conditions later on in life it might lead to, but these indicators are concerning. So be vigilant and be safe. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching. And again, please remember that science changes, so what we know today may not be what we know tomorrow. Stay safe and be healthy.